Happy Friday, everybody. Happy sunny Friday, at least for those of us here in Charlotte. Hope the sun comes out for you, Michelle, in Cambridge. And my name is Blaine Brownell. I'm the director of the School of Architecture here at UNC Charlotte. And I want to welcome all of you, faculty, students, staff, friends of the school, stakeholders, and colleagues and collaborators to this very exciting lecture by Michelle Chang. And with me in the space, we have Peter Wong and Kadi Zhang, who are the coordinators of this year's lecture series, which is a celebration of our 50th anniversary of architecture at UNC Charlotte. And also Greer Friedrich, who runs everything and makes sure everything goes seamlessly as always, my executive assistant, and a group of students invited by Kadi, who will be speaking with Michelle and Kadi after the lecture. And I also want to introduce Alberto Villa-Caballos, who is an alumnus. Welcome back, Alberto. And he is the International Design Director at the Housing Studio. And I want to recognize Alberto and his firm because the Housing Studio has sponsored the lecture today. And what I'll do is I'll introduce the Housing Studio and Alberto, and then Alberto, let you say a few words and then hand it off to Peter for introductions, if that sounds good. The Housing Studio is a full-service architecture and planning firm with offices here in Charlotte, as well as Charleston, South Carolina, specializing in the design and construction of over 80,000 multifamily housing units along the Eastern Seaboard and across the Midwest. And Alberto is, as I mentioned, the International Design Director at the Housing Studio. He has planned and designed communities nationally and abroad. As an alumnus of UNC Charlotte from our BARC program, he invests in destigmatizing the design of affordable housing communities. Alberto.
Thank you, Blaine. And I'll keep it short and sweet. We're really excited to be a part of this, and we're really excited to hear from Michelle. She's such a talented architect. I'll just say we're looking forward to hear from her. And you know, I think you did a great job of talking about what the firm is about. If anything, this time right now is one of the best times to be a designer and an architect. There's so many incredible opportunities in our field at this very time. So we're really excited to be a part of it all. And we're really excited to hear what Michelle has to say. I'll keep it short and sweet like that, Blaine.
Okay, Peter.
Let's see if I can get to a presentation mode here. Welcome, everybody. This is the fifth and final 50th anniversary lecture for the fall term. Like all of the lectures this semester, we're really happy to have some very interesting speakers talking about issues that are related to past issues that we've investigated here at the school, as well as future ones as well. It's a pleasure to introduce Michelle Chang to the podium this afternoon. Michelle directs the office JaJa Co and teaches architectural design at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. She has previously taught at Rice University, UC Berkeley, California College of the Arts, and Northeastern University. She holds a Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University. She's a former McDowell Colony Fellow, a Wortham Fellow, and a recipient of the Architectural League's Prize for young architects and designers. Ms. Chang's work has been exhibited at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Museum of Contemporary Art, Toronto, the Mack Center for Art and Architecture, among other venues. She founded her independent practice in 2014 after working in offices in New York, Boston, San Francisco. Her design work experiments with the overlaps between film, installation, music, teaching, and building. In her research, Ms. Chang studies the techniques and histories of architectural representation. Specifically, she investigates how optics, sound, digital media, and modes of cultural production influence translations between design and building. Her recent writing on noise and vagueness examines these topics. One of the underlying issues you will see in her work is an interest to inspect and to manipulate the underlying mechanisms in which architecture is produced, from representation to building artifacts, and from conventional processes to derivative and discursive techniques that aim to alter the ways we make and perceive buildings. These techniques not only probe the drawings and digital methods architects hold important to their work these days, but also the material and constructive ways buildings are manifest. The lessons she offers are often complex, but nevertheless valuable in the way architects aim to restructure and move forward the discipline of design. So with that, Michelle, I'm going to let you take over the screen.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here. Happy 50th anniversary. Yeah, I'm just so happy to join you all. I hope that the presentation lives up to some of the expectations. All right. All right, so today I'd like to give a sort of overview of some projects I've been working on in relationship to this quality, which is tackiness. Hopefully that becomes clear what tackiness means throughout the discussion of the projects, and I will show you three. But to start, maybe to frame a general approach to the work. Sorry, this, give me 1 second. Zoom. Is this right here, which I came across in the MoMA publication of Solowitz work from the 70s. It's a kind of fortuitous juxtaposition, probably intentionally edited this way, between two essays he wrote in the 70s, one called Ziggurats and one which was an essay on Ruth Vollmer's artistic works called Mathematical Forms. In his essays on Ziggurats, he described, the sort of now famous 1916 zoning laws in New York that required buildings, tall buildings, to set back to allow for daylighting in the urban street. But when he writes of Vollmer's work, he says the following: these pieces are not sculpture; they are ideas made into solid forms. The ideas are illustrations of geometric formula. They're found ideas, not invented and not changed. The pieces are not about math, they're about art. And geometry is used as a beginning, just as a 19th century artist might have used the landscape. Geometry is only a mental fact. I think that which Solowitz writes about Vollmer's work really resonates with the aspirations of my own design process. Representational frameworks, which may be visual, such as in the history of drawing, like perspective and projection, or they might be representations found in practice, like scheduling and even material assembly manuals, to me, are found ideas. Unpacking these found ideas and trying to understand them as historical or social constructs is of interest to me because I think in those ways representation operates as a ideology or a kind of politics. So LeWitt was writing about Vollmer's work, which in the show here are two pieces that are those kinds of ideas made into solid forms. But one could say that in a very similar way, the ziggurats of the zoning law are just that too. That they're not purely mathematical, but as a kind of artistic response to an urban idea. I think with found ideas, there exists a plurality in systems already existing in practice and in the architectural discipline, and representational modes found within them in these two realms, which are, you know, inseparable, are means of translating an ethos into the built world. In other words, say in my teaching and in my work, it's how I think we can cycle between conceptual and perceptual worlds. Just maybe as a little bit of a background in relation to what I said a second ago about visual representation, these found ideas, and what I mean by a plurality of them, and about like a kind of many systems within our field, have operated in enduring ways. If we look back to Aaron Panofsky's Perspective as Symbolic Form, written in the 90s, he traces a history of linear perspective as always being an elastic sense of form. What he means by that is pre-linear perspective, there were many other ideas of perspective, including what's on the left. The world was thought to have been projected onto the back of our eyes, such that the correct drawing of hypostyle or field of column should be curved like it is on the left. So this idea of how one might translate what is perceived into communicable representation was always kind of like a tested theory. Within our field, there are so many conventions that are visualities or socio-historic constructs. And to me, it's about design, the process of design, finding which one is appropriate for the given context of work. So today, I'd like to show you 3 projects. And the 3 projects are an installation, a research project, and a competition I did recently. And these 3 projects, I would say, are framed by a few representational systems. The installation really looks closely at, it's pretty mundane, but I think it's inciting project schedules and guides. The second research project really looks at building codes, and the third, particular way of drawing plans. So this first project that Peter mentioned was at the Mack Center in Los Angeles. It's an installation that was curated and supported by the Art and Architecture Organization, Materials and Applications. It's called Scoring Building. Here's the site, which is inside the courtyard at Schindler's Mackey Apartments. We're looking at the aerial view, and the white rectangle is the courtyard where this installation was built. So the organization, Materials and Applications, put out a competition, now 3 years ago, called Staging Construction. It asks participants to, quote, explore construction as both a practice and a performance. I think really what they were trying to get at in the competition, as I read it, was how do we subdue the primacy of designing buildings as objects, you know, sort of like the translation of a formed object to the real, and foreground the actual process of building as something that has more design agency. So thinking about that, the design took on construction as a representational issue. What do I mean? I mean that the project was designed through a score, which is time-based instead of straight to a 3D model. Try to actually resist the 3D model as much as possible. This score, which you see a piece of on the left, is a series of graphic and written instructions for the builder. To put it together, I was looking at two kinds of documents. First, material installation guides, which you see on the right. What you see on the right is an edited version of real material guides that sort of got redrawn and rewritten. Those are written by trade associations and companies like USG, which is United States Gypsum, and second, as a document, general project management schedules. Those two formats together help me play with construction methods and material artifacts. So here's an example of the first part of the score. So it's pretty repetitive because I think what was important in the design was to think about the duration of action and how certain rhythms of action could play out in the, not just like the sort of construction as a performance, but what implications time and speed might have on the building itself. So you can maybe see some typical methods culled from material guides written in this text, and then certain actions like laying down a piece of board are repeated many, many times. A drawing of each of these steps turned into a notational plan. So these numbers that you see sort of scattered about the field relate to that textual index. And so let's say, for example, establishing the footprint of the pavilion involves laying down a gypsum panel and then repeating that over and over and over until it produces a grid. So instead of inscribing a rectangle, you have to sort of use the product. For the pacing of these instructions, I got really into something called location-based scheduling. Maybe that's familiar to you all, but I would argue that in practice, at least in my experience, most projects use action-based scheduling. Think like Gantt charts, Microsoft Project, and task-oriented spreadsheets. So these task-oriented spreadsheets might say a specific trade, like laying down the foundation, precedes framing, and then there is maybe lag time between those trades meeting. Location-based scheduling, which is drawn out here in that sort of framework, organizes construction according to spaces. So the pacing of the work happens space by space as opposed to the separation of trades. Really repetitive projects like towers that can be built floor by floor, that as a space, makes sense for this way of working. In squaring building, the spaces ended up being a series of nested rooms, which I'll show you in a second. So you'll see there's a kind of framing phase that goes along with the finishing phase, continuously occurring with the construction of the project as a series of programmed events. Because this is an installation for an art and architecture organization. There were a lot of events occurring at the same time. So designing the sort of schedule was trying to find a sort of continuous line of activity where spaces would be made in even intervals. So we kind of see that in these big chunks right here. The way this is laid out, I know this is a little bit boring, but again, I think it has some implications on the way we might think of our work. On the horizontal axis is linear feet and the vertical axis is time. Something, you know, like an installation in a courtyard that typically could take a couple of weeks or a month was stretched out, you know, for, I think it was 2.5 months. Every step, marking, framing, sheathing, and programming were repeated over and over. So this schedule set a rhythm for the appearance, not only of framing and discrete elements, but the appearance of formal and material effects. Since typical like sort of Gantt charts could not create evenly paced work patterns in this sense, we relied on this particular scheduling. The Empire State Building actually used this kind of scheduling by organizing work into continuous speeds. It's part of what helped the Empire State Building super fast-paced construction. It's built very quickly. In effect, I think the timeline became a sequencer that arranged all sorts of effects, forms, material deliveries, payments, room making, and even color changes. Here's kind of what it looked like in model form. On long walls, the builder followed instructions to cut a window every 3rd stud bay, and on short walls, a door every 2nd bay. Everything was pretty repetitive. The stud spacing was slightly modified from 16" on center, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, to follow a syncopated meter. So you'll see it's a little bit a proportion of 3 to 1. In combination, I think these patterns set up 2 deep doors and 2 deep windows, which I'll show in a minute. The mudding instructions establish a different kind of texture. The builders filled gaps between the panels and between where there were sort of holes with gypsum paste according to material specifications, but scraped down that spackle with knives several times. It's traditionally done once and then sanded with sandpaper, but I think the scraping produced a very smooth wall with less dust. So these construction documents, that's obviously were wordier than most. Sampling language from standards organizations, trade associations, and project installation guidelines. And they use notational marks to show how the instructions came together. So you'll see, because it was a slow construction, there was only one moment. Let's see, it was a weekend where everything came together. This was to much dismay of the curator. From a funding perspective, it's not great. I guess to have an installation and only get to see it for a weekend is kind of a contradictory thing, but important to the project. So in mid-February, there was a weekend where it's fully formed until you see this almost like mirroring in the timeline where there was a slow deconstruction. Maybe a quick note about why get obsessed with schedules, especially since they're pretty boring representations of architecture. I think embedded within these different formats are different ideas of efficiency, labor, and production. In reading about project management, I found a lot of texts on different models of defining efficiency. And this is maybe one of the more humorous ones. It's called common time robbers. You know, incomplete work, poor communication channels. A lot of these are incredibly valid. And, you know, for me, a lot to think about in running an office. But also many of them are inherent in the architectural design process and creativity, the need to get involved in details, shifting priorities, impromptu tasks, the felicity of creativity is seen as something inefficient. And so something about the continuous flow of work, I think, allows for a sort of softness in that idea of efficiency. Here are some of the material samples we did in preparation for the instructions written for the builder. And, you know, this of course couldn't be done in normal circumstances, I don't think. But in the installation format, it let me test what could be done with a really long project. Some of the material implications were that repetitive cutting that you see maybe in the sort of middle of the slide, or mudding on the left with time-based dyes made the facture of construction and design element. Everything was off the shelf, in part due to the budget, but also such that a wide array of builders could engage the work. And time-sensitive items were substituted in as much as possible to amplify a kind of choreography. For example, there are 4 colors of chalk coded by levels of permanence: violet, blue, orange, and green. Violet is 0 because it just dusts off. It's oftentimes used for making decking. And orange is a 2 because it stays put. Whereas some of these materials were, I'd say, coded to sort of, index their permanence. Some of them, like the dyes added to spackling, showed you when the next step could occur. So the material was an indicator of the construction process. In the building itself, I think, you know, this partial finishing of the installation hopefully gave a different reading to the form, perhaps more linear than massive. And then here's a kind of aerial view of how in the competition this came together. Corb, he once allegedly said that you know something is architecture when a window is too big or too small. I'm paraphrasing Eisenman's recounting of in a 1982 debate with Christopher Alexander. Eisenman said, once the window was the right size, it was no longer functioning. When it's the right size, that building is merely a building. Ouch. He keeps going. He says, the only way in the presence of architecture that is that feeling, that need for something other, when the window is either too large or too small. So who knows what he meant by too large or small? But what it suggests is that architecture has a role in pushing back against what happens, what appears to be just right. That architecture somehow inhabits the absence, that an unfilled desire forms. To me, this is a wonderful expression of architectural desire. I think it also relates to a sentiment that Bernard Schumi captures when he says, quote, architecture that asserts itself as something emergent rather than final, something we have to strain to keep in focus, and even then, hold only momentarily, just before it slips out of our perception. And in the instant, it's already lost. So this idea of, I think, unfinished and prolonging a process is to pull out a kind of factor of construction and a way of designing through time, but has as much as to do with, let's say, effects in the real world. So those instructions I showed you in the beginning became a way of working on site. There's just some iPhone photos, sorry for the quality. The building wedged into the courtyard. The substitution for colored materials for, so sort of typical ones as much as possible. And the sort of wedged rooms within the courtyard. And then the process of getting built. So the actual installation looks really squished because we found a site. I was, after the competition, we had to find a site. So the most difficult part of the process was not the timing or the budgeting. I thought all of that was incredibly fun, but figuring out how big the pavilion would be. So what we did was we devised a proportional system by using the materials and subdividing the grid based on proportion instead of finite numbers. Relying on material installation guides became really useful at this point because if you look, they rarely reference dimensions. So for example, an 8-foot square is listed as 2 gypsum panel projects for commercial reasons. They're like hawking their product, right? So it's almost becomes a kind of antique way of measuring, but that ended up being pretty helpful when we got the site. Though these instructions were very precise, there was some built-in indeterminacy. A system of drawing circles and parallel lines meant that we were embedding rooms within rooms in a sort of sequential fashion. Doors and windows jostled into place from lines that were kind of askew, and each room was kind of inscribed such that nothing really overlapped. So we developed a series of details to account for that torque. And then the doors being slightly askew and the windows produced a kind of like deep void within the project. And maybe to end the first project, which is the longest description, I'd say that the project is one that excessively adheres to the rules. What do I mean by excessive? It's admittedly adhering to a degree that is beyond a functional limit. So anything that could be doubled or tripled was doubled or tripled. The pavilion's textural, organizational, and perceptual effects all proceeded from this idea of excess. What do I mean by rules? To me, rules were instructions in this case. Instructions for building a room in a gap, which is a courtyard, were repeated 4 times. 1 room inside of another room, inside of another room, inside of another room to produce an enfilade in effect. These instructions were carried out using type 5 construction, but everything was sort of given more time. In the end, I think scoring building was a pavilion, but maybe even more so it was an event. Its schedule explored overlapping notational systems to see how a builder's repertoire could engage design. This extra time, I think, gave a way of working with materials beyond their intended use, and off-the-shelf products made that kind of building according to instructions hopefully possible. To me, building construction is a performance between materials and people, but its movements are rarely considered as design. Yes, part of it, but maybe not primarily. Rather, efficiency determines coordination. The rush to finish perhaps overlooks the potential for a construction process to operate compositionally. When typical building acts are included as part of architectural aesthetics, construction choreography, in my mind, becomes interdependent with its physical form. So the next two projects I'll go over more quickly. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's a research project and then a competition I did in a similar fashion. Just trying to find these, I would say, complex, even convoluted systems within our practice and discipline to try to distill them, maybe even discursively, to try to uncover an ethos in a sort of material project. So if the first one was more about schedules and guides, the second one is called Urban Imaginaries. It's a research project I've been doing for the last year and a half as part of the Richard Rogers Fellowship. And the research is it's a comparative study of US building codes and UK building regulations to see the language that is used in the way of a sort of evincing the material built environment through diagrams, how that supports a public imaginary, how that mentally images or projects a kind of future for what the built environment should be. So to start, I started thinking about building law and what kind of legal descriptions there are, what kind of syntax is involved in that. Immediately I thought of property descriptions. This is the meets and bounds. Maybe you all know this already, probably do, where there are all sorts of rules to erase as much as possible the ambiguity in what a property looks like. So you'll see there's a short description on the first line, and then it says at the end, being more particularly described as, and then there's a whole paragraph. There's some combination of cardinal directions, geometry, iron pipes, concrete monuments, basically a kind of material infrastructure that helps describe land. What those material elements changes given the context, but what endures is this intense specificity. And the second one, instead of concrete monuments, it's a railroad track. All that, reading the sort of legal descriptions reminded me of Solowitz, 1970 work, 75 work, The Location of a Rectangle. So there's a kind of absurdity to it, which is the instructions on the right are extremely long. It's one run-on sentence, and it's extremely convoluted. And in the end, what you draw is a rectangle on a piece of paper. If you look at how it's written, though, the entire page is thought of as a series of midpoints and endpoints. Whereas like the legal description is a series of cardinal directions and sort of like monuments. And trying to sort of parse that, I think, has, one's experiences quite a lot of difficulty. So on one hand, in the research on a kind of urban imaginary, I was looking at the inscrutability of certain kinds of text, which is seemingly, very objective, neutral, and quantitative. And trying to mine the instances of more qualitative or social descriptions within that. So There's a tone of the language, but perhaps there's a more qualitative distinction. So terms like normal, written in the California Building Code, this is not exceptional, but here's one instance, which means conforming to a pattern or standard regarded as usual or typical, sets up an expectation of homogeneity within building forms in a neighborhood, or elevates that. Or in Chesapeake, Virginia, where I'm currently working on a building project, the one that Peter showed in his slide. There's the definition of family to help define single family dwelling, which sort of idealizes a very particular social structure. In Chesapeake, family is 5 people, blood related. And then says, okay, outside of those 5 people, there are domestic servants, quote unquote, who live on the premises but cannot be counted as family, or 2 adults with their dependents. So seemingly very innocuous syntax and a sort of objective approach to specificity contains quite a lot of subjectivity in it. Why this interests me is I'm interested in how architectural categories are set up in practice and the discipline, in the ways that defining these categories have a performative force in society, not only symbolically, but also physically. So how does the definition of the categorization of a family manifest in something like a single family house? The number of bedrooms, and the combination of rooms. Building laws, including hundreds of pages of code, define similar concepts like home and neighborhood. Some characterizations are very clear. So for example, a Bensonhurst house in Brooklyn has a 35-foot height limit, but many definitions like a home must be quote unquote modest in Cambridge are imprecise. This vagueness leaves designers and many officials to interpret abstract intent in the context of a real world. So maybe I'll show you a kind of process of the research under a similar lens of thinking of these texts as representational devices. To try to understand the real world applications of these categories, we started looking into a lot of court cases wherein particular definitions were contested. So you look on the right, in Chesapeake, Virginia again, the arguments for and against what constitutes a boarding house not only are about the kind of material artifact of the building, but also its use and the nature of the relations between people who are inside. And then some observations, because this was a cross-national study between the US and UK, what the tone of the language was. So one observation was that in the US, the code is authoritative and the language is very precise. UK building regulations, even in Wales, were relatively precise definitions. So I'm forgetting now, but instead of fire rated wall, it was called 1 thermal unit, things like this. And that there's less specificity, and as such, there's a different way of imagining, like, let's say, the envelope of a building. Local plans are more fuzzy for that reason, because of that lack of specificity, and language could sometimes be convoluted and extended. So understanding, I think, a kind of syntax maybe helps us understand the kind of projective capacity of specificity and vagueness. In trying to instrumentalize the research, not to leave it just as a kind of textual analysis, I began working on a kind of digital methodology. How might we link a very disciplinary and professional understanding of building law to the one that exists more in the public imagination. So the idea was to test out through image to text analysis what the meaning of certain images were. So using, and particularly in this slide, we're testing the recognition of house and home through different materials. We're using Google Vision as a platform which samples Google images and the keywords associated with images that you look up. So maybe the upshot of this is we find that, you know, an elevation that includes brick and timber cladding is more house-like than one that just has gray stucco. So in terms of thinking about categories, the confidence that something belongs into house or home is materially linked, more so with some than others. We also did this with color. This didn't reveal that many sort of nuances, but this was surprising. Certain colors, particularly pink, have a sort of category that shows up that is its color. You know, so like a blue house all the way on the bottom right is a house. It's still a house and a home. It's still real estate. That's what it's picturing. But a pink house is in the category of pink. So the degree to which pink might not adhere to a public perception of house, I think is somewhat indicated there. So that was a kind of image analysis. On the production side, started engaging a kind of, sounds more technical than it is, a machine learning platform. So on the left, you'll see that there's a color-coded sketch. Each color relates to a keyword. In the sort of opposite way of the analysis, light blue is ground, blue is wood, you know, pink is sky. Using that machine learning translation that takes, you know, a coded sketch and changes it into a picture from sampling databases, similarly of like Google Images, we get this very vague picture of what the combination of those keywords might mean. So I thought what was nice about this maybe more projective process was just a sort of test of how much specificity would, let's say, dilute or enhance one's public perception of words like house or home according to this methodology. So there's, let's say in this slide, a sweet spot in the middle where we're confident that it's house and not anything else, but with more or less specificity that gets a little bit borderline. In the end, we're working with translating actual lines of code to do the same thing. So on the left, a line from a zoning resolution in New York City, and on the right from Cambridge housing design guidance. So I guess the research was trying to capture what might be the public imagination, both architects and a sort of lay audience of a highly specific, almost esoteric body of text. And as such, text was rendered in image as a kind of meaning. The degree to which all the images that were produced, the degree to which they're legible, I think shows how much professional codes and lay speak overlap. So when house looks like a typical house, like the one on the right, I think the law is hewing to conventions of public perception, since the process is using, you know, like Google image database and keywords, that alignment means like it's close. More often than not than our studies, like in the one on the left, however, what's conveyed in the text and what's conveyed in the image do not align. It becomes pretty inscrutable. Documents in the New York zoning resolution try to make familiar concepts sharp and concrete with jargon and wordiness. But ironically, these descriptions make their images interpretations fairly abstract. Okay. Lastly, I'll show you a short competition project that I worked on last year called Millefeuille. Maybe as a little bit of background, for the past 2 years, I've been teaching a class on magic. I know that sounds maybe kind of ridiculous, but I teach along with studios in our digital media sequence, which are the classes on technology. And the first time I taught it, I was teaching it from a very technical standpoint, you know, like the stuff I was talking about a second ago, computation, algorithms and whatnot. And for the past 2 years, I've been thinking about what effects technology has on its users. And I think part of it has to do with the enchantment that technology affords. The class I'm teaching right now starts with 2 definitions of magic. One of them is from the British anthropologist Alfred Gell. And he says there's a technology of enchantment where one's ideas that arise when one's ideas of technology and what technology can do are incommensurable to something real. Like our expectations of what technology is surpassed by a real thing. The case study is this canoe prow in Papua New Guinean tribe called the Trobrians. The carving is so intricate, it's so beyond the sort of common practices that it, in his studies, enchants the sort of neighboring islands, such that when the tribes barter with one another, these canoe prows present an authority that makes it easier for the Trobrian tribe to trade. That's fairly specific. I think in effect, there's a kind of material consequence of technology, and part of that has to do with the phenomena of the enchantment that technology affords. The other is from an essay written by Jeff Kipnis called "And Then Something Magical." It's a very phenomenological understanding of magic. He writes about Stephen Hall's Nelson Atkins Museum extension. And the definition of magic has to do with a kind of dynamism of the ground and our expectations of how the ground performs, a dynamism between what we consider to be art and architecture, a sort of typology of experiences by moving through these sort of shapely forms, and a dynamism between our expectations of like what art is and how we see it. So it's more about the sort of experience of being in the building and what that does to you, perhaps more aligned with sort of architectural technical supports. So in this competition, it was a sort of housing project, but really I wanted to do this competition to sort of play out some of these ideas. We were looking at mazes. I wanted to find somewhere in between those 2 theories of magic. We took mazes on as plans. So there was still a quality of convolution and technical proficiency, you know, in the canoe prow, but also experientially dynamic because we took it on as a plan. In developing these mazes, we tested out tiles of different color to try to produce these sort of convolutional patterns, such that we understood the tiles to be working when it was difficult to sort of trace one path and tear apart perceptually one strand from another. So the bottom row, for example, was no good, but the second to bottom row was a little bit better. So because this is a housing competition, we ended up working with the tile. There had to be some kind of economies of scale. But the tile, instead of being a unit, was a section of the building that included both the public space and the private. We did a lot of these tests, and eventually it became something more worked out. Quick note on the site. The site was in Houston along the Braves Bayou, in an area where there are several 5/1, these sort of like developed housing projects that maximize the footprint of the building on the lot, of course, but still try to maintain light with, let's say in this one right here, I'm gonna use my arrow, a linear pattern. So at least in this crop of the city, you can see how that strategy played out. And then trying to develop the design of the housing project was an exercise in articulating the tile into units, but also how one might experience the pattern, but also the pattern as an image, but also the sort of the space is more of a mental construction. So the ground floor is lifted. There's a series of stairs that take you up in a way that you might be able to experience those courtyards as an image projected onto a plaza. The units are organized in a kind of convolutional ring with a collective courtyard where one can sort of see that ring and move around a pretty independent public space. In this project, maybe in a similar fashion to the one I started with, we produced a material index substituting out colorful materials for conventional ones, like instead of plastic caps that are white, red. And we tried to develop a material assembly, a thermal barrier that was more like a fabric texture than something that would be covered up with drywall. That plays out as a kind of layered system shown in the blown up plan and assembly drawing that then gets propagated over and over again in the entire project. So I hope that those three projects give you a sense of a kind of interest that I have, which takes on fairly specific and complex representational structures, which I would say the first two are within the discipline and the second, practice, and perhaps the second one more in theory, as a way of uncovering an ethos of how different collectives structure space. The first project, Scoring Building, was about material transformation through construction. The second one having to do with how laws, events, a kind of more legible imagination or less legible imagination. The third one is how this sort of complex systems and that illegibility might actually be positive as a way of engendering a kind of Enchantment. Thanks so much.
I'm sorry, Michelle. I would like to make a comment. And could you just return to the issue of tackiness for us then,
Yeah.
relative to these projects?
Yeah, sure. Can I just, maybe I'll read something that I wrote about
Yeah.
that.
Mhm.
I don't want to take long. So in the 1990s, the anthropologist Alfred Gell, who I mentioned, theorized, he was doing a lot of work on decorative art. At the time, he theorized that decorated art forms act as social mediators when they're mentally fixating or quote unquote tacky. So tacky to him was like a conceptual stickiness. In his 1998 book, Art and Agency, he proposed that an attraction to pattern artifacts cannot be totally attributed to aesthetics or meaning. It can't just be like purely indexical, but rather to what he called a pleasurable frustration of figuring something out. So let's say like the motifs on a decorative vase, understanding how the rotations come together like a maze, there is some pleasure in trying to like read that. So for Gell, a complex arrangement is like a difficult text. It's for him largely intellectual as opposed to phenomenological. They invite these interpretations that happen line by line. Maybe one more example, Celtic knotwork for him is believed to arrest evil spirits in a state of unraveling its braids, turning something ordinary like stone into a source of persistent wonder, the transformational process of technology, right? So the effect is not purely just from like the object in and of itself, but from the effort in envisioning how that thing was made. So the decorated object, when there is that tackiness, it stokes fantasies about the context around the production of the thing. And this is, I guess, where it gets social. For Gell, it prolongs the relationship people have with things because of it.
You mean it to be more of a coalescing agent that includes many things that are integrated. That stickiness. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Very good. Thank you. I'm going to let Caddy go ahead and take over.
Sure. I don't know if Glenn, you want to say something. Otherwise, I will just go ahead, start the Q&A session.
Yeah, go for it, Caddy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michelle, so much. It's a really wonderful talk, and I've received a lot of text messages and comments already. It's just super inspirational in terms of how you use representational conventions and construction choreography and the digital rules, all as agencies of design to review different possibilities of architectural discipline. I would like to briefly introduce the panel today. We have 5 students coming from different programs and year level, and they will introduce themselves. All of them studied some of your work and writings, so they prepared some questions and thought they might have new questions and thoughts throughout the talk. But we would start with Elliot.
Hey, I'm Elliot, graduate student here at UC Charlotte. But yeah, I am like severely impressed by your work. And I think what I find most intriguing about it is your ability to kind of decipher patterns and then like restate those patterns in a different way, where it draws a new conclusion for, your materials or laws and like making these things that are so rudimentary and kind of simple to an extent, and then exploding them to a different level, and then taking it back to that kind of like a fundamental kind of rigor of pattern. which is a really, really amazing talent and kind of workflow, I guess. But I think my first question about that is, do you find that like, I think as I'm like hearing about your work and reading your kind of writings of this like vagueness and the categorization and how that relates to that, it's like, do you feel like there's this kind of human nature aspect to it where we're kind of as creatures interested in categories and patterns, and if that applies to if you find that kind of observation of yourself or of other people as it relates to your work. Yeah.
The sort of, thank you, by the way, it's really, really flattering. The impulse of developing technology, right? The impulse of developing systems for understanding. I mean, I think for me, absolutely, I'm very trying to be less so like this, but I'm very epistemologically motivated. I want to know, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think there are definitely problems to that, but and the sort of pattern finding is just the way, I think the only way in systems that are exceptionally complex to get there. I think another way of thinking about pattern finding is a way of thinking about diagrams, which, a diagram, this is from Michael Hayes, who I understand is next. So maybe ask him about this too. He says this a lot better than I can, but diagrams necessarily have both a discursive and an empirical component to them. And the pattern finding, I think, in ways of working is like, what is that discursive diagram of a representational framework?
It's really nice to see that, and I think also it holds like it's like that pleasurable frustration that you stated. Like it is like so much so like, oh, like I want to figure this out, and so I'm like deciphering all these little like clues, and it's kind of mystery. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts about architecture. So yeah, nice. I like it.
All right, thank you both. I think Lyra had something along a similar line. Lyra, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, my name is Lyra. I'm currently a third-year undergraduate student. So I'm really impressed by the diverse set of work you have, where you've explored film, color, linear perspective, and even magic, and how that translates into architecture. So I'm really curious about your iterative process. So is there a specific method in knowing where to start and where to end that process? And at what point do you know something like music or even magic implements spatial qualities or architectural qualities?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is it kind of like how do you know when something is cooked enough?
Yeah, okay. That's exactly what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, maybe like with the last project, as an example, we were working on mazes for weeks. I mean, a maze is a maze, right? Like there's a way of reading it as just the sort of empirical diagram. It looks like a maze. And then looking at it as a plan, which is, where we needed to get to. And I think there was a point when we were working on these mazes where we realized that there were sort of categories of effects happening, and trying to anticipate like what those categories might do if they were more understood as a plan. And I think I like to work that way, which is to, let's say in the maze example, to make as many as necessary to start to call them something else besides mazes. So like the linear loop or the textural field, you know, so those kinds of things, and being able to say, okay, that as a generator for architectural effects doesn't necessarily depend on me choosing one loop-de-loop or another, but it would just perhaps do the same thing. And so, yeah, getting to the point of categories and trying to oscillate that to some architectural implication is how I think I know when to stop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kat, go ahead, ask the third question, please.
Hi, I'm Kat. I'm a third year undergrad student. As I was like focusing, I kind of focused on your article, Something Vague, and it just kind of stuck with me. And you discussed fuzziness, and I was wondering if you thought fuzziness could be beneficial to those with non-architectural knowledge and help them understand what's happening, like spatial qualities kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So fuzziness as like a not hard boundary, but one that fuzziness is like how to expand a hard boundary to include things that one wouldn't typically consider to be part of that category, like red. So I don't, the way I think about it is more like, how do we introduce like inclusiveness by questioning what we define to be a conventional like thing like red. So I think fuzziness perhaps can help those outside of like an architectural discipline through a process of like, I don't know if it's argumentation, but through that questioning. And so that's what I love about teaching, which is, you know, like there's certain lessons that I've taught. I mean, I've taught this magic class, you know, there's certain things you teach over and over, but students have this amazing way of putting new light onto categories that you think are very solid and enduring. I think that is the kind of fuzziness. Yeah, and then this other definition of fuzziness, which is imprecision. In that essay, one of the ways of talking about it was like fuzzy thinking. How imprecision, let's say from what is it called, self-driving car, is terrible. You know, like the self-driving car is like, I need to get to the coordinate of like 21,50. So you're just like parallel parking for like hours, whereas a person just, you know, just does this and then they're parked. I think there is a value in that kind of roughness in terms of like getting something done, not having to be like super exact, and acknowledging that there is an effect that you're going for as opposed to getting the thing precise. That's there too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually have a really quick question about that, Michelle, because you were talking about the construction process and the locational notation system. I was wondering how you set up the tolerance kind of threshold and system, because you described that in a very precise way of each particular step and material and measurements. But the appreciation of fuzziness and the result and the effect of fuzziness actually becoming very evident. And so I was wondering whether or not that was part of a category of the fuzzy or the vague that they were considering in terms of the construction process.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I wonder if it was fuzzy. I think it, yeah, okay. So there was too much time for everything, kind of, right? So it wasn't an exercise in like, well, one, I talked to the builder early. I had a great one. His name is Bob Dornberger in LA. But the problem wasn't like, how do we squeeze your work to get to like less time? But more so like, how do we draw it out? Can you spackle for way more days than you should? And so the fuzziness was just actually probably about slowness rather than trying to, does this make sense? To try to get the boundary to be like plus or minus 1 day. Actually, I mean, real talk, like what was hard was I hired someone to go to the site every day because I think the real worry was the builder just would finish early and not go back. So the fuzziness was to try to ensure a kind of like slow, very continuous process, which actually, yeah, that was difficult.
That's super interesting. All these, process secret that is unveiled in the, as the result. That is super interesting. I think Nick is the next question. Nick.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you for speaking to us. I'm a graduate student here at UNCC, and yeah, I enjoyed looking at your work because it had a sort of, I felt it had an undertone of positivity towards some of the challenges in reconciling the real and the digital, and control and sort of ambiguity. And I wonder if that relationship between, when looking at antiquity and the way that perspective was portrayed then and then in the Renaissance, and you have many references to like raster images and how that's like a major way that we consume or receive information. And it, I guess, made me wonder, is the relationship between sort of noise and fuzziness and control more pronounced now, and of like more importance to sort of, not importance, but like, it seems like it's either we're more aware of it or there's more of it. And I wonder whether you had any thoughts on that, and how sort of this identifying these relationships is important in sort of getting people through a tricky era of like information and different realizations about the world and everything.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Well, I'm glad it seemed positive because I am very positive. But yeah, I'm trying to think of how to answer this. Like, is there more fuzziness and noise than there once was? Because yeah, there is, right? Of increasing specificity and data affluence and whatnot. And what that does in terms of our contemporary moment. I mean, it's a really hard question. I think, I suppose like one way I could answer it is just like, there's an infallibility of technology that I think is sometimes presumed because of its complexity. Something like AI algorithms, or like the neural network graphic machine learning stuff that I was using. But inherent to all those processes is the noise and fuzziness. And in some ways, it's something that some algorithms aspire to have to produce a more human-like effect. So what do I mean by that? I think maybe you wrote about this in the vagueness essay, I can't remember, but with the development of AI, the trick was, for a while, how to get computers to think like people. And then now, I suppose like that problem is how to introduce error and sort of fallibility in something so mathematically precise, how things may seem like more lifelike than they actually are. So I think, I don't know, trying to understand how those systems theorize natural and lifelike, I think is productive, given the pervasiveness of these data affluent systems. I hope that answers your question.
It does. I was rambling a little just because there's, there's many topics that you cover, and just sort of looking at how the whether there's more information now or we're just more aware of it. And I think you covered that. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. And then we have the last question, Nicholas Rollins, about magic.
Oh.
You're muted.
There we go. Hi, Michelle. My name is Nicholas. I'm also a graduate student here studying computational design. And I'm really interested in this class you mentioned about magic and the what you describe as the phenomena of enchantment. And yeah, I think enchantment, it can be a way of injecting delight into the perception of design, but it can also be problematic in some ways as well. And so I'm wondering, do you think that maybe the architect has an obligation to dispel magical perceptions surrounding technology or digital media, with regards to other members of the profession, as well as to the public at large? And if so, how would you recommend doing that?
Yeah, great question. So my favorite line from the Gell essay, it's called, the essay is called Technology of Enchantment and the Enchantment of Technology. He says about the sort of negative side of magic, he's describing how beautiful Bernini sculptures were, how incredibly lifelike he made stone. But Bernini was commissioned by Louis XIV to do these works. And so Gell says, what Bernini can do to marble, Louis XIV can do to you. So the beauty of the work, the technical proficiency of the work also conveys an authority in that, a resistance to the work because of money or time. I don't know. I think for me, it's not about demystifying or really championing the enchanting effects of technology, but rather trying to understand more nuanced descriptions for how these things work, such that we can deploy them in like more specific ways. So I think magic is such a hard topic because like talking about magic ruins it, and it has that sort of authority, right? As soon as you say like, oh, actually it works like this, like talking about like a magic trick, then you're like, oh, this is like nothing now. And so I think the way I've been going about it in teaching, at least, is trying to get to adjacent topics, like the way in which things seem like they're moving, right? And animism. But maybe back to your question, I think there is, I think there's a responsibility to understand it. Such that we understand the sort of negative effects of the authoritative nature of some architectures in the kind of Louis XIV way. How do we go about doing it? I think it's like a more, I don't think I have like a straight shot answer, but studying the ways in which certain work is embedded with the authority of like the state or of a certain kind of client that is eventually symbolized through certain buildings. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Thanks.
So there's a quote Professor Jeff Ballmer posted in the chat. I was wondering if Michelle, you want to respond to that quickly or not. It's fine. But he said about third law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah, I think, yeah, sure, definitely. I think part of that maybe I would add is to a specific culture, in a specific context, right? It's so like audience dependent that like the Trobriand canoes, like the Papua New Guinean tribes, definitely magical to them, but maybe not to us. So.
Thank you so much. And I think that is about time. I will return that to Blaine for closing remarks.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. You've given us so many things to think about today, Michelle. And magic, science, art, poetry, mazes. I want to mention, you may know that Leslie Van Duzer at University of British Columbia is working on magic as well. So that might be, yeah, Leslie Van Duzer. So just to summarize what we've experienced today through your thought-provoking lecture, just want to make a few points. One is that I think it's a great reminder, especially for our students, about the process of generating instructions for others, since architects are not always the ones building the work, right? We're typically, or at least often, removed from the process. And your work also reminds us that in normative practice, there's this frustrating divide between types of information, between quantitative and qualitative information. The classic divide is between the drawings and specifications, in the sense that the design teams are typically much more familiar with the drawings, the quantitative side, than they are the specifications. And it's one or two people sort of working in a dark corner, typically, I generalize, for spec writers, actually working on the quality of the thing, right? Or perhaps some are much more conscious of the legal descriptions of things, but don't really know the material bill of goods, right? So there are these kind of, it's strange that there are these bifurcations of information, and I love that your work productively kind of crosses the divide between these types of information and explores opportunities, and also the limits of the exchanges between them. And there are all these questions about automation that is, of course, a buzzword today, right? Your work addresses approaches like parametricism, codes of instruction, artificial intelligence with things like Google Vision, raises questions about issues of control and agency in architecture. Do we really have control like we thought we did? What does that look like? But I think that the rich kind of conceptual space that you've created through your work is a reminder that automation isn't a binary condition, human versus machine, or a handoff in a linear process, but rather it's a kind of continuous unfolding exchange. And that in the end, I'm thinking of the first project, for example, there's still the presence of manually applied materiality, right? That's tangible. It's not sort of like, you know, the human mind is most present up front and then sort of hands things off progressively. So I love the richness, the whimsy, and the fact that the entire process can be a kind of theoretical exploration and platform. So you've given us a lot to think about today, Michelle, and thank you for that. And I want to thank Caddy and the students for great conversation. Peter for a great intro, and Alberto, and the Housing Studio for your sponsorship, along with AIA Charlotte, who sponsored our lecture series, Greer for your wonderful run of show talents, and hope everyone will have a wonderful and inspiring weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. That was amazing.
Bye.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Blaine.